My name is Kyle Taylor. I'm the director of Fair Vote UK, which is an organization that campaigns on election safeguarding and digital rights. I'm also on the steering committee of the Real Facebook Oversight Board. The Real Facebook Oversight Board is a project that was started by Carol Cadwalader and her group, The Citizens. It follows their creation of another organization called Independent Sage, which they set up as a response to the government's politicization of the SAGE Health Committee in giving COVID advice. So the Real Facebook Oversight Board wanted to respond to the crisis that is Facebook's lack of accountability and regulation. And Facebook announced more than a year ago that they were going to be setting up their own quote-unquote Supreme Court of Facebook, which would be independent of Facebook, making decisions about the company in terms of content. And then they announced that it wouldn't be active until after the U.S. election, which of course was fast approaching at the time. And so Carol decided that there needed to be some form of accountability and set up the Real Facebook Oversight Board. So we've brought together some of the leading voices in civil rights, activism, academia, and disinformation to sort of shed light on the biggest issues on the platform. From rampant disinformation and misinformation, massive efforts to suppress votes and voters in the upcoming U.S. election, and of course a litany of other abuses committed by the largest and most important, most significant social media company in the world. We have to remember that since the 2016 election and the Brexit referendum and the follow-on around the Cambridge Analytica scandal and other data scandals, there's been almost no change to regulation in either the UK or US law, or really in any country around the world. And Facebook has twice as many monthly active users as the population of China. So their ability to influence and their ability to reach an extreme number of people is quite unprecedented. And because they're so big, they're almost at this point too big to fix. And governments don't seem to even have the knowledge base to equip them to even be able to approach Facebook as a corporate entity instead of what it's being treated as now, which is a sort of extrajudicial super state that is fundamentally changing the way that we live on this planet.
What kind of power or influence does the Real Facebook Oversight Board have? What can it actually do in practice?
So the Real Facebook Oversight Board is completely independent of Facebook, as any accountability project should be. What we have focused on is making clear demands around safeguarding the US election. So from enforcing their own policy around inciting violence, because I'm sure a lot of people will remember that the current president, Donald Trump, has a sort of pastime of signaling to white supremacist groups, and that has led to real-world violence already. And it's happening on Facebook. And the key thing to remember is that none of this is new, and the approach that we're taking is to point out lessons the US can learn from other parts of the world. You know, Facebook was complicit in a genocide in Myanmar, and we can't forget that. It was a central tool used to exterminate people. And it was, again, used in Kenosha in the US around the Black Lives Matter movement to incite violence there, which I believe Mark Zuckerberg called an operational mistake. Something that leads to death is not an operational mistake. And so by making demands and putting pressure on, we're hoping that we can have an impact. We have seen since we launched that QAnon was banned, Holocaust denial was banned. Yes, it's 2020, and Holocaust denial was only just banned on Facebook. And they've taken other actions around paid ads that were aiming to delegitimize the election's results. But there is so much more that Facebook needs to do, and the fundamental shift needs to happen around independent, truly independent, and democratically accountable oversight.
What is the kind of problem with Facebook in terms of, Zuckerberg calling it an operational mistake? What's the kind of issue with Facebook's attitude towards these kind of problems?
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one, and it wields more power than definitely any media type entity that's ever existed. And the pace at which information can travel on Facebook means that it actually exceeds the human capacity to comprehend. So we're actually now living with something that is too extreme, too fast, too big for us to cope with as a species. And when you think about it through that lens, you really have to ask the question, okay, if this is going to exist, then how should it exist? Never before have we seen a platform, as they call themselves. They're far more than a platform, of course, but where people can come together around ideas that actually, used to perhaps be seen as, no harm done. For example, the Flat Earth Society, which is rampant on Facebook, to a place where they're actually having, real impacts on human life. And it's that connection of the online to offline that we can't forget is essential. Facebook is used as a tool to act offline in the real world that creates actual harm to people's lives. From facilitating a genocide to allowing the transfer of information about false information around COVID, the pandemic that has led to, for example, the 5G conspiracy that suggested that 5G towers were causing and spreading the virus. Over 70 5G towers in the UK were then damaged or burned down as a result of this conspiracy theory. QAnon, which has become a global conspiracy theory now around this sort of narrative that there's some secret, liberal, satanic deep state that's actually running the world, that leads again to offline violence. The biggest thing we've seen in the US is armed militias using Facebook to organize election-related violence. So people will probably remember Donald Trump telling the Proud Boys to stand by. And you'll probably also remember the scale to which he has suggested that people become poll watchers, which is coded language for show up to polling stations with guns and try and create an influence environment that makes people very, very uncomfortable. All effectively to try and steal an election by disincentivizing votes. We have to remember as well that the offline effect is magnified right now because we have this signaling thing happening for people who either believe in COVID or don't, which is wearing a mask. And so when you're at a polling place and you want to cause harm to people who aren't voting for Donald Trump, you'll start with people who are wearing masks. Because Trump supporters are, I think it's 60% less likely to wear a mask than somebody who says they're supporting Biden. So this stuff has real world implications. It isn't just connecting people. It is harming people.
How much of the stuff that you're talking about that Facebook's being used for is actually, illegal? The sort of specific comments that Trump's making, militias making a Facebook event saying we're going to be at this location at this time to defend this property. How much of that is explicitly illegal, and is the problem sort of with that grey area about some of it not being explicitly illegal, and how do you cope with that?
So the issue around, what is legal, what is illegal on Facebook extends beyond into sort of all of social media and the internet. And this, what happened as these technologies emerged, which was people creating a sort of secondary identity online where they will say and do things that they would never do in the real world. And so while there's a great deal of law around, inciting violence and hatred, it's this idea of whether it actually did incite it or they were just sort of joking. And this is the fundamental thing to remember that hasn't happened, which is we haven't had this come to Jesus around whether or not stuff on social media is as valid as stuff that happens in real life. Of course, we know the answer to that because we've seen it firsthand through the violence that's been caused and facilitated by Facebook. But it's constantly framed as the antithesis of the free speech debate. The idea that if you restrict people's ability to, say, suggest to people that they should take a gun, go to a place, and shoot black and brown people, that is somehow some massive infringement on civil rights. And we have to remember, of course, that there's the harm principle, right? Is your speech going to cause harm? Could your speech cause harm to someone? But there's also this piece around free speech that we have to consider, which is the idea that there must be a limit, right? And it's called the tolerance paradox. It's the idea that if you're using your speech to push for intolerance, you cannot tolerate that to maintain a tolerant society, right? I'll try and explain it one more time because it's a quite mind-bending idea, actually. So the tolerance paradox suggests that to create a tolerant society, you have to be intolerant of intolerance, right? So, which is why, for example, no one would think it's socially acceptable or should be legally acceptable to suggest that we should exterminate an entire group of people, right? I mean, we all accept that there's a limit on that. So why isn't there a limit when there's massive violence being, pushed against black and brown communities in the United States and against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar?
Talking about Myanmar, I think there's a lot of people who use Facebook, to share pictures of their pets and shit like that. And they hear, Facebook was used to facilitate a genocide halfway across the world, and they think that's crazy talk. How is this? That's not possible. Me and my friends just share recipes on Facebook. How does Facebook facilitate a genocide?
Okay, there's a few pieces here. We have to remember as well, I say that so much, we have to remember. Let me try it again. The way that we use Facebook in the UK or the US or what would traditionally be known as developed countries is very different than how Facebook is used in other parts of the world. This is primarily because in large parts of the world, the internet is Facebook. It's very common in developing countries for Facebook to come free with your cell phone plan. So people end up spending their entire online existence within Facebook. What you then have to layer into that is Facebook's model, which is an ad revenue model. So if you want to sell as many ads as possible, you want to keep people on the platform as long as possible. So how do you do that? Well, you only deliver them content that keeps them happy, or that they're enticed by, that they agree with. And what happens over time with an algorithm that's learning from what you're seeing is it pushes you further and further to an extreme within that frame of how you exist online. And so you might start by reading an article that raises questions about whether a parcel of land in a country belongs to country X or actually belongs to country Y, and all of a sudden find yourself in a vortex of how one specific group stole this land, and also here's this other crazy thing that's not true about what they do to babies, and it becomes more and more extreme and more galvanizing. And this is built in. I mean, I think what we have left, we cannot forget that this is the model. This is the point of Facebook. They are fighting for your attention to sell ads to you. You're not their customer, you're their product. Their customer is anyone buying ad space in your newsfeed. So they have no incentive to deliver you the truth. Their only incentive is to keep you on as long as possible, to sell as many ads as possible, to make as much money as possible. That is not in sync with what we need as a society to function. We need shared reality, right? We need everyone to agree on the facts and be living in the same world. We need free flow of truth in expression so that we can actually differentiate between real threats and fake threats that have been, sort of created to pit us against each other. And if we can go really big in terms of human beings as a species, we are facing an existential threat in the form of climate change. And yet we have countries in the world who still, a majority of people, have been convinced that climate change doesn't exist. How are we going to fight for our own survival if we don't agree on reality?
How much of it is these, social media companies going, oh my god, it's the 21st century, this has got way bigger than we ever expected it to. Look at Russian interference, we don't know what we're doing, we're sort of trying to catch up and make the best of it. and how much of it is they're just evil companies that just want to make a buck and they don't really give a shit?
When you start to dissect the tech industry as a whole, the original frame we were all sold is what we've all been socialized to believe is true, right? Which is the idea that like tech is different than other industries, and it's just a medium. You know, it's what people do with it that's bad, and that fails to recognize that these are just private companies who are, you know, duty bound, in some cases legally bound to maximize profit for shareholders. And so they're going to do that by any means necessary. They care most about making money. And so that's the first point in terms of the business, right? Let's accept that these are just companies like any other company. Their goal is to make as much money as possible, and that isn't necessarily in line with our society's aims and objectives. Second, let's look at their market position, right? Not since big oil have we seen such a consolidation in a sector. And oftentimes people put Facebook, Twitter, and Google into the same bucket. And they're very, very different. Their business models, while ad driven, are built on very different functions. And yet we try and sort of speak about them as if they're one giant glob or entity. So we're struggling there. We are struggling as well to fully recognize the individuals behind these companies. And that's specifically about Mark Zuckerberg. And, you know, at the Real Facebook Oversight Board, we have Roger McNamee as one of our Brains Trust members. He was actually Mark Zuckerberg's mentor for nearly 3 years in the sort of build-up of Facebook. And he has shed so much light on the sort of psychology of this person. Right, so what we hear from him is a person that believes deeply in authoritarianism, believes deeply in consolidation of power, and also believes that Facebook itself is a sovereign nation with more citizens than any country on earth. And when you take that lens, the way that he behaves and the company behaves starts to make perfect sense, because that's what's happening. You know, there's a consolidation of power. There is a too big to fix objective here to build a company that is so large, but that society is so dependent on, we are incapable of acting. And what I mean by so dependent on is that the science of this platform is built to be addictive. And so if you're finding that, you know, you can't get off Facebook, that isn't just entirely you. You know, we have to start looking at social media and the obsession with sort of digital engagement as an illness and an addiction that needs to be treated. One example, the infinite scroll, how your feed scrolls forever and ever and ever on Facebook and Twitter, that was designed to mirror slot machines. And the psychology behind slot machines, which is this idea that, you know, on a slot machine, the next pull, you're going to be a big winner. Just like on Facebook, that next swipe is going to show you the most amazing piece of content you've ever seen. At the same time, the change is happening faster than our own evolution. And so we're dealing with tools that we are not equipped to actually deal with. We don't know enough about in an environment that is the antithesis of what we need to be doing as a species, right? Like, we are a social species. We know that. We know, you know, our evolution has been highly dependent on the fact that we can collaborate and build stuff together. And yet, what is social media? A completely individualized experience. Think about that. No two Facebook feeds are the same. Every individual Facebook feed is designed specifically for that individual. That is, how do we work together if we're all living in our completely individualized reality?
How much of an impact does that have, you know, on this kind of social level? Obviously, this political level, it's increasing the divisions, but also the idea that your social feed is so completely different to the person who lives next door to you, or even someone within your own household, within your friendship group, people that are that close, that it's that specific. How much of an impact does that have on people in their individual relationships?
What happens when social media builds these sort of individual realities is that it also socializes us to believe that everything should be exactly as we want it. So because your feed just gives you stuff you like, and it's constantly reaffirming, it actually lowers our ability to manage and handle adversity because we're not used to it. So the best example I can think of at present is this sort of extreme polarization that we're seeing in our politics, a far right and a far left. And because people are getting most of their information through their own social media feeds, it gives them the impression that way more people agree with them than actually do. And because they can always find affirmation for their point of view, they lose the ability to understand the need to compromise. And we saw it in 2016 with the Democratic primary between Hillary and Bernie, where there was this narrative that there was some grand conspiracy against Bernie Sanders, when in actual fact, there just aren't that many people who agree with Bernie Sanders' point of view. So instead of saying, okay, we made our voice heard, we are in the arena, now let's try and influence the actual politics, it's just a complete disregard, and they're all the same. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were not the same. And here we are in 2020 looking at the exact same thing. And the amount of effort that goes into trying to convince the furthest left position, for example, that Joe Biden, in the US context, is more like them than Donald Trump just seems excessive. And so when you think about, okay, yeah, I live in the same house with people, how can our shared reality be that different? Well, it can, because if you clicked, liked, shared, commented, read something else somewhere else online that was different from someone else in your house, you're now in a whole different spiral than they are of information and influence operations aimed at driving a response from you.
So kind of following on from that point, when we see these kind of conservatives in America, people like Kyle Rittenhouse, and they're kind of seeing these Black Lives Matter protests, and they're thinking, oh my god, these are riots, these are horrible, violent terrorist, groups marching through our cities. How much are they to blame for thinking about that? Those individuals who, is it entirely on them that they're thinking that way, or should we be having sympathy for those people who have just had this constant barrage of being told that Black Lives Matter are terrorists? Where do we sort of draw that line in terms of having sympathy for those people that are having horrible views because of their newsfeed?
Yeah. So there's often this idea with artificial intelligence and machine learning that it will somehow counteract what's happening in our societies. But the opposite is true. Artificial intelligence and machine learning only reinforces and furthers what's existing in our society. So if you look at the US, for people who aren't familiar, the history of racial violence, oppression, and harm is since the beginning, the founding of the country, and it has not improved. And the tinge of white supremacy has always been more than a tinge. The difference is that it was disparate at a time, and so people were scattered around. What Facebook's done is allow them all to connect and act. And so when you look at the real world violence and the response violence of, say, a white supremacist to protests around Black Lives Matter, two things in that situation are true. One, that white person probably does not understand at all the situation of people of color in the United States, and so has no context to empathize. Two, is living in a self-fulfilling, reinforcing social media environment where they are told repeatedly that everything from that point of view is wrong and to be disregarded, and then take action. So while people who commit violent acts are 100% responsible for their actions, because you are responsible for your actions, the influence and cause that got them to that place is possibly preventable. And we have seen, the interesting thing is the racism in this aspect as well, right? So we have seen Facebook be able to respond to violent extremism when it is framed as Muslim violent extremism. We have seen their ability to de-radicalize around ISIS in 2015. We've seen their ability to meet the demands of the German government, who set a much higher standard on content moderation. And yet, with white supremacy, we do not see the same vigor to actually act. And I think it's because a majority of users on Facebook would be white in America because a majority of people in America are white. And so why would you try and upset the user base that generates you the most money? So again, even white supremacy is incentivized by this system. And there's no reason to think they would act differently in any way, shape, or form.
How much has Facebook taken over from sort of traditional education? Nobody's, at least in the UK now, nobody's watching, the news at 10 o'clock anymore. We don't get our news that way. The average viewing age of Fox is 70 plus, but it's the same for the BBC. How much has Facebook replaced our traditional methods of getting information, and not just in terms of news, but in terms of being educated about, almost anything in the world outside of our direct experience?
Okay. When we think about how we learn stuff now, your first thought is probably Google, right? Search on Google. Let me Google it. Your second thought is probably Wikipedia, which is by and large well-verified, good baseline information. That's when you're trying to educate yourself intentionally. But when you're passively learning, when you're finding out new things, it's probably happening on social media from friends, right? An article they shared, a post about something a friend told them. You probably notice a lot of stuff on social media like, a really good friend told me, blah, blah, blah. And there's this bizarre phenomenon with this, which is that people are more likely to believe something that a friend has shared, regardless of whether they can verify it themselves at all. They'll often take it completely on face value in a way that you would never do in real life. And we don't fully understand yet why that is. It's primarily the confirmation bias you get from having someone you know tell you something as opposed to an entity tell you something. And it's also the personalization of direct communication with people who would have once been held behind an interview with a famous broadcaster or something. Instead, you get this sense that, on Twitter and Facebook that celebrities and politicians are just like your friends and they're talking directly to you. And so it changes the dynamic where you don't have that, you're treating that information as a friend, a family member, and not treating it for what it is, which is a public official or a public, persona like a Kardashian or something, who's giving you information that's unverified and unmediated through the traditional sources that we've relied on to help us sieve through information. And of course, the news, it's called the fourth estate when you learn about it in political theory and politics classes. It's that important thing that holds power to account and connects citizens to their governments and institutions. And the degradation of news and verified news and the emergence of opinion as fact, fueled by social media, is fundamentally changing how we experience and receive and learn through the internet.
Just sort of doubling back a little bit to what you said about white supremacy and when most people in America being white. Do you think there's an element of, Trump's in the White House? Do you think there's an element of Facebook being a bit lax on it because of who's in the White House and the way things have been? You look at Twitter and they're kind of, fact-checking warnings on Trump's tweets and stuff more prepared, a lot more eager to do that kind of stuff, but Facebook really seems to be dragging its heels in that regard. Do you think there's an element of them being a bit more fickle, perhaps, with kind of who's in power?
Okay, so we look at Facebook, we look at their lack of action, Mark Zuckerberg having, off the books meetings with Donald Trump in the White House. And we have to ask ourselves, well, why? Why would this person, this liberal elite, normally people would frame someone like Mark Zuckerberg as a liberal elite, Silicon Valley tech bro, who traditionally are on the left. But, again, we have to go back to fierce self-interest. Mark Zuckerberg is the majority shareholder of Facebook. And at present, Facebook has huge interests in merging different aspects of their business. And they're deeply afraid of a regulatory environment that could potentially force them to break up, force them to sell off different assets, or limit their ability to merge data from different pieces into one sort of super entity. And who's extremely anti-regulation? The Republicans, Donald Trump. So what they have in the White House is a friend, really, for their business and for their personal interests. And I think we're seeing more action, though by no means enough, more action in the last few days in the run-up to the election, because the writing's sort of on the wall that Joe Biden will get more votes, way more votes than Donald Trump. Now, will Joe Biden win? That's a bigger question because, Republicans have spent 40 years finding ways to get around the actual, will of the people because their voting share has decreased continuously since 1988. That's actually a really important thing to remember. That's actually a really important thing to remember. Since 1988, when George Bush Sr. became president, Republicans have only won the popular vote once, in 2004, when George W. Bush won re-election. Every other election, 92, 96, 2000, where Bush became president, even though Al Gore got more votes, 08, 2012, 2016, Democrats won the popular vote. There are not more people in America who support Republicans. There are just rules that are built in to reinforce historic white supremacy and the history of slavery in America.
Brilliant.
Sort of started on it and then went somewhere else.
No,
but
that's really nice. I've got a list of little videos that we can cover.
Okay.
And that's definitely one of them. So just sort of being conscious of time, I think last question really to wrap up. How does this sort of impact the UK? A lot of the stuff that we're talking about is American-based, American politics. For people in the UK, what are the sort of implications of this stuff? The idea that it does also affect them. It's not just big American.
Because Facebook's a global company, it affects people everywhere, including the UK. And I think the UK to an even greater extent at the moment. So what we know is the Brexit referendum in 2016 was the proving ground for whether mass disinformation campaigns on social media would work. Those lessons were then applied to Trump's 2016 presidential run. And, we followed up with the fake news inquiry, but the government here has not acted at all. And what we see in the future, in the near future, is a United States likely led by Joe Biden that will be, unfriendly to tech and, quite frankly, unfriendly to the UK because obviously the US relationship with the EU is a much greater in terms of value and security than with the UK. And an EU as well that is driving towards regulation and a much more citizen-led environment for tech. So then there's the UK in the middle. And we've heard all the hoopla around the online harms bill and, we're going to be world leading on preventing harm online. And yet what we know is, and what we've seen and heard, is that the bill here is going to be quite the opposite. Largely, probably written by tech companies for tech companies as a way to attract an industry that is being shunned by the US and Europe. So here in the UK, we're looking at ending up being a sort of tax haven, outpost for the harms of big tech. And we should be deeply, deeply concerned. We have a government that does not care about citizens, about democracy. It cares only about staying in power by any means necessary, who have prioritized the idea of voter ID and voter fraud as the biggest crisis facing our democracy, when the incidence of voter fraud in this country are 0.0000055%. It is so small, it's not really even possible to calculate the effect of quote-unquote voter fraud. And the second priority, which is giving back voting rights to British citizens who've lived overseas for more than 15 years. Guess what a majority of those people identify as? Conservatives. Who would have thought it? So you don't have a government that is looking out for you. You don't have a government that is prioritizing you over big tech. You have a government that's prioritizing themselves and their own power. And we've seen what it's done in the context of coronavirus, and it will do equal harm in the long term through big tech. Not immediately in terms of tragic lives lost, but in long-term effects in our real world.
Amazing.
Is that all right?
Fantastic.
Okay.